Thank you so much, Denise, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm so thrilled to be a part of this conversation, and of course, I want to thank Arts and Ideas for hosting a day-long event of environmental voices. So we hope that you stick around for the other conversations. Now, this panel was advertised as a powerful conversation. And I just want to put it out there that these two young people are bringing the power. And so we're so thrilled to have them both here to learn about their work and, of course, to talk about strategies for positive change in our local communities as well. So I'll do a quick introduction of both of our panelists, and then we'll start the conversation. And I wanted to let you know that we'll leave time for audience participation as well. So if you have a question for our panelists, please save that for probably the last 10 minutes of this hour. I'll start with Adrian Huq, a climate activist and organizer. How are you, Adrian?
How are you?
I'm doing well. Adrian co-founded the New Haven Climate Movement Youth Action Team in 2019. And I wanted to say congratulations because Adrian just graduated from Tufts University and will be an incoming graduate student at the Yale School of the Environment. And they are also a proud alum of New Haven Public Schools. Adrian also coordinates, yes, we should applaud that as well.
Thank you.
Adrian also coordinates the Climate Justice Schools Initiative, a joint program between New Haven Climate Movement and New Haven Public Schools that fosters greater climate awareness. Additionally, as youth coordinator of the Climate Health Education Project, they have facilitated an internship program that supports New Haven high school students in advancing climate education in their school communities since 2018. Adrian has worked at various environmental organizations over the last 6 years and also is engaged in work surrounding media, journalism, communications, and art. I'm glad to hear it, Adrian. Adrian's also a freelance writer with the New Haven Arts paper focused primarily on environmental events and was selected as a 2023 Arts Awardee by the Arts Council of Greater New Haven. They have spoken at more than 40 climate-related events and rallies across Connecticut and serve on the Connecticut Climate Education Advisory Committee and on the Energy Subcommittee of the Connecticut Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So what do you do in your free time, Adrian?
Well, I love climate work, so that is a big passion for me. So I love what I do, so I don't feel like it's a chore ever.
Well, welcome, Adrian, to the panel.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Kwolanne Felix, a writer, gender, and climate scholar, and is the fellowship and community manager at Black Girl Environmentalist. This is a national organization dedicated to addressing the pathway and retention issue in the climate movement for Black girls, women, and gender-expansive people. Kwolanne took the train in from the city. How was your travel?
I would say pretty great. I was pleasantly surprised by Metro North. It was very direct, and I got to sleep.
We're glad that you had an uneventful morning. Kwolanne is a recent graduate of Columbia University. Congratulations. Where she studied history with a focus on the African diaspora, international development, and environmental policies. Kwolanne writes opinion pieces and articles addressing politics, gender, climate, race, and other intersecting experiences, and her writing has been published in Truth Out, Ms. Magazine, Womanly Magazine, and the Eco Justice Program. Kwolanne has worked at the United Nations, the Reproductive Rights and Climate Justice Coalition, and Columbia Climate School. She's also a Gender Equality Public Voices Fellow and was a 2021 UN Human Rights Fellow. Kwolanne, it sounds like you have a lot of free time as well. Welcome to you.
Thank you so much for having me, New Haven.
So I wanted to begin, and I wanted to ask each of you to share a personal reason behind why you have decided to dedicate your time, your scholarship, your career, your writing to climate action. Adrian, I'll start with you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so one anecdote I can share for what brings me to the climate space is my family. So my mom is actually right there in the audience, but one of the values instilled, oh, thank you. One of the values that she instilled in me particularly was, just observing how diligently my family reused and recycled. It definitely stuck with me and, changed the way that my brain is wired around waste and environmentalism. And so seeing that compared to the amount of waste I was seeing, for example, in my school and out in the public, I really started to feel that disconnect. And so my first environmental interests were around recycling and food waste and pollution, and getting active on that in middle school, taking my friends' extra fruit home from school, bringing their recyclables home so we could recycle it at home because our school district didn't have recycling, and then expanding upon those interests in high school by continuing to connect with teachers about that issue, and also trying to advocate to the New Haven Board of Education about, how can we get a recycling route? How can we combat food waste? Looking at the protocols around food sharing. So those were my first interests in environmentalism. And later on, as I started working in energy efficiency and later was introduced to climate organizing, this all sort of came together in a perfect storm of, wow, climate change is extremely serious. And combining that with social justice, climate justice is a really serious issue as well. So I would say it definitely started from the family and grew into something much bigger.
Kwolanne, how about you?
I think for me, I was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, which is an island nation, but I grew up in Miami, Florida, which is also a frontline community. So I think for me, and my community was also mostly, Black low-income immigrants. So I feel like we didn't have the luxury to call the climate crisis a hoax. We looked around, and every year was hurricanes. I lived through Katrina. And saw the property damage in my own community. So I feel like for me growing up and, similar to Adrian, my parents were just conscious of the environment. But I think when I looked into the greater environmental movement, you would think that, poor immigrant communities had nothing to say, nothing to contribute, because the environmental movement is very framed over this very white middle class kind of understanding at the time as to what it means to engage. For example, let it be I feel like when I was growing up, environmentalism was going to the national parks and going kayaking, and I think also getting an electric vehicle. But when you're a low-income person who is, as Adrian mentioned, probably barely producing that much waste, you don't have money to go on the airplane. You don't have money to, live luxurious lifestyle. So even the idea of cutting back is something that we're already practicing to honestly, stretch a dollar. So at first I kind of felt like I was always conscious of the environmental movement, but I wasn't really sure how it connected to me because the narratives just kind of felt a little bit mismatchy. I was already recycling. We were already kind of conscious of food waste, once again, because we were low-income people. But as I grew up, I started working a lot on kind of social justice issues. But I was also a historian. I studied history at Columbia. And when I say history and tell people I work in climate activism, they're usually like, oh, what does one have to do with the other? But I think as I continued with my work in history, I think something that I found was that something that is that communities of color have been at the front lines of the climate crisis. Honestly, most times without choice, if you're living in a low-income community that is disproportionately affected by hurricanes and floodings, that is just your reality. But once again, that narrative wasn't really kind of moving towards the mainstream. So I looked into history itself. And I kind of started to find these amazing climate activists. Currently, I'm working at Black Girl Environmentalist. We're running a program called the Hazel M. Johnson Program. The namesake Hazel M. Johnson was a talented climate activist in Chicago's in the 70s, honestly, before the greenhouse gas effect and its impact on the climate crisis was barely being known. She was doing that kind of work. So I think for a lot of my work, it's kind of connecting that history of the ways that Black communities, Indigenous communities, poor communities have been engaging with the climate crisis and really kind of challenging this narrative as to what it means to be an environmentalist. And I feel like during that time, I've kind of found my place in assuring that, the climate policies that we're producing are looking at the crisis in an intersectional lens. And hopefully, as we create a movement forward, we're kind of looking at the communities that have traditionally been left behind in this narrative of environmentalism, but have been doing that work, and hopefully bring them along with us so that we can create, a climate future where it's not just folks who can get Teslas who are included in that future. It's also folks who need to take public transportation, will be included in that future. So that's a lot of the work I do and how I really got started.
You mentioned you grew up in Miami, born in Haiti. Haiti has been devastated by, we know, hurricanes. Miami, South Florida, recently under a state of emergency. It's a state of the governor, he who shall not be named, who has scrubbed the term climate change from policy. So when we hear about these extreme weather events and extreme flooding, whether it's in Miami or the north end of Hartford, when we think about the people that are impacted, it's more than a number, right? So I saw in the news 2 million people impacted by the flooding in South Florida. Who are these people we're talking about, Kwolanne?
Yes, I think Florida as a state is a state full of contradictions. I think that, the day before the flooding happened, that is when the law that was passed by he who should not be named scrubbed climate change in all of Florida policy. So if you're producing a piece of policy on the state level, it cannot include the term climate change. Next day, we have terrible flooding. But Miami in particular is such an interesting city. Our last mayor, who was a Republican nominee who you guys didn't hear about because he didn't get that far, he's also known, and he ran on the ticket of, as a Republican, of making climate conscious policy because, once again, Miami, you don't really have the luxury to call it a hoax when you see the hurricanes, when your insurance rates are going up, when you feel the flooding. There's kind of an interesting disconnect in Florida. But I think when you're talking about who these people are, of course, there's across class, across race, folks are being affected. The flooding, in many ways, isn't necessarily discriminating as to whose house it's hitting. And looking at, as we mentioned, the kind of compounding factors of like, okay, if we, looking at the city of Miami, for example, a wealthy person who may have been able to get news of the flooding, who may have, let's just say, another vacation home in upstate Florida, that has a very different experience than maybe a renter who this is all they have, and who may not necessarily have the luxury to push their landlord to kind of fix things. So I think those compounding effects are always happening. Miami in particular is a site of climate gentrification, which is an emerging issue in the state. So it's places that I grew up, which are, for example, Little Haiti, which is by its name a little Haitian community in Miami. Climate gentrification is what's happening is developers are, scavenging for the little plots of land that are a little bit more resilient to the climate crisis. So for Little Haiti, it's a little bit more flood resistant. And of course, that's a huge advantage for the community members who are already low income, who are already immigrants. But developers are like, this is the land that we need, and are quickly pushing folks out. And where are they pushing them to? Places that are even more vulnerable to the climate crisis, even more vulnerable to flooding in particular. So I think Florida is, I love my state in many ways, which is not a popular thing to say, but I do think it's so beautiful, and it has so much history and so many diverse people, and I grew up in such a multicultural space. It's devastating to see how the climate crisis is affecting us, and to remember that folks aren't giving up, even though obviously our governor is certainly not setting us up for success, but climate activists throughout the state, throughout my city in particular, are definitely passionate, are consistently pushing back, and are also finding ways to move around the law. Even though climate crisis can't be named the law, Florida's known for extreme weather event resilience planning, which is, going around the name. So I think folks are, still really active, particularly the folks that are being hit the worst in Miami. But obviously in a future world that we will have, because we'll be winning great elections, we'll have a Miami that has the policy that it needs to react to the climate crisis in a way that is deeply intersectional, that's looking at low-income folks who are experiencing climate gentrification, and folks who are immigrant folks who are also experiencing different kind of forms of compounding effects of climate crisis.
you for that context, Kwolanne. So, Adrian, when we might get discouraged when we see certain policymakers making decisions that aren't for the benefit of the people that they're supposed to be serving, but we're here to talk about optimism, and I wanted you to talk more. And this is something that Kwolanne referenced. You know, how has this movement, this climate action movement, the environmentalist movement, become more inclusive? What were some of the factors, and do you feel accepted today?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, certainly the environmental movement as a whole has been deeply transformed, I would say, from what it was last century. So a lot of the early environmental movement, we could say, is, white dominated, very like national parks, very natural, like conservation focus. And now in the 21st century, we're seeing more of an influx of diverse peoples entering the climate movement and centering the most affected people and places, bringing in that climate justice focus. And especially today, I would say, with major environmental organizations in the United States, it has, I would say, become almost déclassé to not be intersectional. So, for example, people around 2020 were calling out the Sierra Club nationally for like, what are you saying about racism? How are you looking at your own organization internally and dealing with that in the wake of the Black Lives Matter revival? And so, yeah, I've seen a lot of major environmental organizations really undertake equity and understand how they can fit into that movement, because it is so crucial for everyone to be engaged. And I also think now with a even more youth-focused climate movement that has had so many positives. So I would say, looking back at 2019, when one of our figureheads, but certainly not representative of the full climate movement, but when Greta Thunberg launched the Fridays for Future international movement in 2019, a lot of people were paying attention in the media to, youth working on climate change. And obviously, throughout social movements in history, youth have been at the forefront. But especially for climate change, this is very crucial, because younger generations and future generations are going to be impacted most by climate change. And then even more disproportionate factors when we're looking at different subsects of the population, such as low-income people, people of color, also LGBTQ people, which we can talk about later. So yeah, I would say certainly there's been a huge undertaking of the climate movement when it comes to intersectionality, and I'm really grateful to be an activist in it today, where I feel like I do feel more welcome in the climate movement, and I do see a lot of women and non-binary and people of color within the climate movement, and young people who are getting activated within their own communities and defining what environmentalism looks like to them. And it's not what it looked like 100 years ago. So I'm grateful for that.
You mentioned LGBTQ individuals, and I had asked Kwolanne earlier when we talk about the people most impacted by climate change. So can you talk about that, what recent studies have shown, and even with the people that you work with, Adrian?
Yeah, of course. So people might not know the connections between these two things. A lot of people, might not see that link between what are the underlying factors between being LGBTQ and facing disproportionate climate impacts. So I'll just share a few statistics. So one thing I'll mention is, given their susceptibility to poverty via factors such as familial rejection, mental health issues, underemployment, and substance abuse, and collectively 22% of LGBTQ people in the United States face poverty, and the rates increase for transgender populations and people of color. And also looking at houselessness, among the most vulnerable populations to climate change are people without stable housing. And looking at LGBTQ youth, they're 120% more likely to experience homelessness than their peers, which is a big crisis. And often homeless people lack those basic necessities to handle extreme weather and will face the brunt of hazards such as extreme heat if they're out on the streets. And also, furthermore, with just the the responses after climate disasters, LGBTQ people might be denied or late to receive disaster relief from discriminatory governments or aid organizations. So yeah, I would say just looking at the underlying factors of poverty, underemployment, homelessness, these are some really big issues for the LGBTQ community that connect with climate vulnerability.
Kwolanne, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I think that I think when we think of like, okay, diversity in the climate movement, it's just like, okay, let's just have, women, black and brown faces, just, for the optics. But I think something that folks tend to miss out is that we're missing out real important knowledge when we're not including people. So kind of, as I said, I love me some history, but something to note is that, communities on the margins of society have been fighting fossil fuel companies even before scientists were able to clearly link the greenhouse gas effect with high carbon emissions with climate change. So as I mentioned, let it be Native American communities who are being dispossessed of their land. They have been opposing oil companies for decades. Let it be poor white communities in Appalachia who had long histories as coal miners. They were fighting for environmental and labor rights for decades as they experienced diseases such as black lung. Let it be black low-income communities. Black communities in general have, I would say, 40% or 40% more likely than white communities to experience asthma. The reason is because we're disproportionately placed, especially in urban environments, near industries and factories that are burning fossil fuels. And all those communities have been on the front lines fighting these companies, demanding better environmental rights. As the contemporary climate movement has emerged, that is a whole bucket of knowledge that folks have been fighting for decades against these companies that we're not tapping into. That we're moving forward without these communities when they know these companies, when they've been fighting them in their backyard for, as I said, for decades, and they know their strategies, but they also know the impacts. When scientists came out and were able to once again chart that fossil fuels are killing the earth, these communities already knew that because fossil fuels were killing them. So it's not just, kind of a nice to have in terms of, okay, let's have a diverse climate movement that makes us, progressive, but really on a strategy level, we're missing out. So as I mentioned, Hazel M. Johnson, which is the program I run at Black Girl Environmentalist, she emerged in the 70s after her husband died of lung cancer in South Side of Chicago. And, she was a mother of 7 children, and they were all being affected by respiratory ailments. So she decided to do some research. She realized that she was sandwiched. She already knew that she was sandwiched, the South Side of Chicago, between factories, landfills, and sanitation department centers. And, when she was doing some more research, her community had some of the highest rates of cancer in all of Illinois. And on top of that, the city of Chicago was also feeding them toxic waters. So she got organized, and she created the People for Community Recovery, and has been organizing since the 70s. So now, as a climate movement today, what are we doing with that knowledge? Are we just kind of just like, okay, that was nice? That's real knowledge in how to kind of fight for environmental justice. Obviously, it's in a particular scale, and it's very local, and it can't necessarily be copied and pasted. But we have a legacy. It's not like, young people came out in the 2010s who were like, oh my God, the environment's an issue. Communities have been doing that work. And if we're kind of moving forward without them, that is a whole strategy issue that we're completely missing. But also as we move forward as well with this question of intersectionality, it's also kind of not just including folks and, their faces, but also including their issues. I think one of the reasons communities at the margins of societies haven't been included in the climate movement is because it's not just about the environment for them. When Native American folks with the Dakota Access Pipeline in the late 2010s were fighting against, the creation of the pipeline, and still are fighting against it, it wasn't just a climate change issue for them. It was also an issue of land and respecting sacred lands and their rights to sovereignty. When communities in urban areas are fighting against these fossil fuel companies, particularly Black and low-income communities, it's not just about a climate issue. It's also about histories of racial segregation and how they persist. And the environmental movement has been really shy about touching those issues. They're like, oh goodness, native sovereignty, race, gender. no, we're just focused on the environment. And that's inefficient. And I think young people, as Adrian mentioned, are coming to the scene. And when environmental organizations like, no, we need to focus on just the environment, they're saying this is how we focus. We focus by looking at these interlocking issues. We focus by bringing the knowledge of diverse communities and how they connect with the climate crisis. That we're not gonna really get to the bottom of this issue if we're only kind of focused on, as I said, electric vehicles and bicycling, if we're not looking at the substance and honestly, the people who may have some of that knowledge of some of those kind of deeper rooted issues are folks who are on the margin and who've already been experiencing environmental crisis for decades.
So we've talked about inclusivity, intersectionality. I'm wondering if we can shift and talk about power of the local, because again, it is easy to be discouraged when you see inaction on the international level or even the national level as we look to the upcoming election, the question of whether a candidate may return, and we know what that administration did to, again, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. Climate action is not something that this potential administration would continue. So I'm wondering, Adrian, I wanted to go to you because you have been active in the city of New Haven from the time that you were in high school. And when we think about the power of the local, how local elections matter, but also grassroots movement, can you describe what you have seen happen recently in the city of New Haven and how that might give you hope?
Yeah, for sure. So firstly, I'm very grateful. I see a lot of wonderful people from the city of New Haven that I work with on climate and environment in the audience. So thank you for being here. And it's a pleasure to work with all of you. Working locally in grassroots organizing has been deeply fulfilling in many ways. And I also think that's partially because having those same targets of, New Haven City Hall, New Haven Board of Education, and really, being there like every week, every month, hammering on our different demands, using different strategies has been really impactful. And we've been able to see many different policy successes and investments and wins on dozens of campaigns that we've hosted over the years. Having that being led by mainly high school and college student age group, and building leadership skills as they do that. And so some things that I'm excited about for New Haven Climate Movement this summer, we are gearing up for some more art making, outreach, and research surrounding the impacts of climate change on the oceans, and community education around that, and also tying that back to New Haven, locally, how that is impacting Long Island Sound, our local waterways as well. And we're also, you'll have to stay tuned for when we officially launch, but we are working on—
breaking news here.
Yes. A transportation-related campaign surrounding free bus passes, since we look to, in our climate solutions, have those co-benefits with helping low-income communities and families in New Haven and centering equity in our climate solutions, so that not only are we helping the environment, but also giving back to our community here in New Haven and recognizing those impacts. Given that New Haven is a coastal city, so we have those sea level rise impacts that we're seeing, but also in terms of our demographics and acknowledging, for example, how we had a lot of climate refugees actually from Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria who have settled here in New Haven. And so really tying this global issue into the local. And so those are some things that I'm excited about going ahead. I'm excited for more wins and more successes as we continue to hammer down on local government.
Kwolanne, I'm curious if you could talk about the impact of local action to help spur policy change or even education.
Yeah, I think that, there's nothing will ever replace, of course, federal action. We need our government and we need to vote to make sure that, they're creating great climate policy. But as we know, for example, with the Inflation Reduction Act, it's not like Biden says, let there be climate policy, and then boom, you see a tree in your neighborhood, kind of, then you see like recycling centers. It is the local people who, assure that money is going somewhere, who assure that that policy is actually kind of, has teeth and is being effective. Even though, once again, the federal is absolutely important, but in reality, it's the local that really makes the climate policy move. I talk about Miami because, once again, it's an interesting city because, as I said, we're in a not even federal, looking at state government that is once again very anti-discussing climate. But something I really love about the city of Miami is that, as I said, activists are very innovative, city council members are innovative, to kind of find those routes, to really think about, okay, honestly, regardless of the politics, regardless of the blue and the red, folks need to, people have needs, and the hurricanes aren't stopping just because we call ourselves one political party or another. This is the reality. We see it. There's no denying it. And I think that that's been really exciting for me. In an ideal world, of course, we'd have like state politicians who are also aligned. But, looking at Miami, the local is super important, because regardless of what's happening in Tallahassee, which is our state capital, folks are moving. Folks are looking at how to kind of create climate policy. In Miami, climate resilience is like actually a really big issue on how to assure that regardless of how our government is calling it, those realities are kind of met. And you wouldn't know that. I think that's something that's super interesting, because I think when people hear Florida, they're like, okay, that's a climate denying state. They don't care. None of them, this is just out of their reach. No, and in the reality, local governments are facing that. Local communities are facing that, and that's affecting how people vote. It's affecting how people turn out. It's affecting property values. I think the thing about climate change as well, which is it's unfortunate that it has to come to this issue about money, because it really is about people in our ecologies and our in biodiversity. But money also moves. So I think looking at local governments too, who are facing climate crisis, it's an economic crisis for them. Developers can't make money in real estate if everywhere is flooded. So I think regardless, local governments have to be on their toes and are forced by it. I think in an ideal world, probably like the city of New Haven, before you feel the force of the hurricane or the flooding, your state politicians are already kind of implementing, changing those kind of realities to prepare for them, and are supporting low-income communities. But I do think, regardless of how different cities stand, climate change is consistently becoming a reality. Extreme heat's becoming consistent reality, and people are feeling it. So, and governments kind of have to react no matter what they're saying on the campaign trail, which I think is fascinating. But I think also looking at where I live now in New York, in terms of like climate optimism, climate change could be a really depressing topic if you sit on it on like kind of a surface level. I think the thing that really keeps me engaged is really connecting to my local community and just really kind of remembering that this earth is worth saving. Even if it's things like, composting, going to my local community garden, or sitting in at my local environmental justice organization and listening. It's a reminder that like folks can't afford to lose hope. It's here, whether we like it or not. And it's not really a question of how optimistic we are. It's here, and we just have to deal with it. And of course, the goal is that we can deal with it effectively, where the effects won't continue to be more and more devastating. But I think for me, engaging in local climate issues, remembering what's happening in my state policy, what's happening down my street, is always really encouraging, just because it's just like, of course, it's a big, scary global issue, but when you ground it in the local, things become a lot more tangible. It feels more real, and kind of the fight feels a lot more manageable when you're focusing on things that you can see, things that feel really real to you, and continuously staying engaged in there. And I think if we're staying engaged in the local, it makes it easier for us to engage in the national and the international, because we're grounding it within our own realities.
I am curious, with a show of hands in the audience, how many of you are optimistic about climate action? So maybe half? Adrian, does that surprise you?
I would say not surprising, since climate change is a huge and daunting issue. And I feel like, we do have a lot of like small wins that are coming out of various like communities, for example, across the country, and sometimes some state and federal wins. But a lot of times, it's hard to see those manifest in our communities if it's coming from like a state or federal scope. And so a lot of people are not seeing like the needle push that much, and especially in a very politicized climate, we see all of these things in the news, climate deniers, and just, a lot of bad policy practices that really sort of dampen our mood as climate activists and people who care about climate change. But that is another reason that I feel like a climate optimist, is being involved in local organizing, especially where you do feel the rewarding factor of being around a core group of people, in my case, a core group of young people that all care about the same issue. And, you know, we meet like every week or multiple times a week, and we continue like working on our campaign. So, you know, it keeps the morale up. But on a grand scheme of things, I can definitely understand people feeling down in the dumps about climate change, especially given, you know, a few years ago when United Nations said, you know, we really have until 2030 to cut our world's global emissions in half. And it's 2024 now, and we're 6 years away from 2030, and we're not seeing those drastic cuts in emissions. We are seeing some small policies here and there, but really we are not where we need to be for that 2030 track. And we've seen like bold climate policies, you know, sort of, you know, die along the way, such as the Green New Deal, which did have like a 2030 deadline to really transform the United States with like high-speed rail, cutting emissions, all these really great things that climate activists would want to see. And so we've seen a lot of great bills die, you know, even on a state level here in Connecticut. So I do understand the doom and gloom, but I think we do need everyone all in, not just young people. We need people from all generations to get involved in climate change, however you want to plug in. Not everyone needs to be an organizer, but I would love if everyone can plug in and support in their own kind of way. So it's not just left up to the youth.
You hit an interesting point that I wanted to expand on, and Kwolanne, I'm going to ask you to answer this. When we think about how science is important, and scientists in the room communicating, what the studies and the data show, but at times, and you hit on this, if the message is negative, does it lead people to just sit in a corner like, well, what is this one thing that I'm going to do here in, small town Connecticut really going to matter on a global scale? And so I wanted you to talk about that, Kwolanne, about how scientists and other people in power, how they communicate and how that can impact the action of people here in this room.
I think that's also one of the difficult things about climate crisis and the scale of it, especially with the data. It can get daunting. It can almost make people shut down. Like you hear, like it's almost like drawl of like, this is happening. Here's the data on where we're at. Like deforestation, water acidification, biodiversity loss. It's really easy for folks to shut down. And I think that is a complication with the way that traditionally in the past, I hope in hopefully moving away from it, that scientists have really kind of talked about the climate crisis. And I think that's also why I study history. I think something that's fascinating about the human mind and just, in history itself, I often say like the Romans in the middle of the end of the Roman Empire probably could not have imagined that life in history would have changed so quickly, that the Roman Empire fell so quickly. And I think of Rome was not built in a day, but it certainly didn't fall in a day. Though, of course, when we look back, we can impose our own views. And I kind of see that with the same way looking at the climate crisis. It is really daunting. And I think for most of us, it's hard to imagine a very different system. It's hard to imagine a system that isn't based in fossil fuels, a system where we're not consuming plastic like we do, that we probably aren't driving like we do, that we aren't flying like we do. It feels too big to, we don't have, what kind of models do we have to imagine a very different world that is not only not based on petrochemicals and fossil fuels, but also is where people's relationship with the earth is really different. And I think as a historian, something I'm kind of always thinking about, I guess to kind of bring it back, when I first kind of started working in the space as a historian, I thought I had some hunches, but most people were like, okay, what are you doing here? Maybe you need to be a scientist or an economist to really make an impact. A historian simply doesn't have a place. What am I doing rummaging through the past to find, these future answers? And I think I was at a seminar with this geographer at Syracuse University, or University of Syracuse, and something she said, she was like, in order for us to imagine a climate future, we're going to have to, it's not just about like the numbers of like, what we're going to be cutting. Our mindset, the way we actually see ourselves in relationship to the earth is going to be scrapped and has to be put anew. Like this idea that the earth is something is, fresh for the picking and we can take and take and take, and we're not related to and there's no impact on that we can have exponential growth and without the limits of, on a finite planet. all of that is going to have to change, like the way we really actually view ourselves in relationship to that. And I think that's something that scientists can't always communicate with numbers. And I think that's actually where the humanists, the humanities, is, as we stand in the at Yale's Humanities Building, really come into play. It's to kind of allow us to imagine a very different world. And this professor, as she mentioned, she talked about climate histories. And, you know, her goal isn't to say that when we talk about climate histories or environmental histories, it's not to say that we need to all go to the Stone Age and, you know, live the way that our many great grandparents lived. No, it's actually to remind us that another world is possible, that the way in which we exist with the earth, the way that we understand the earth, the way that we use our resources, those are not eternal processes that have always existed. In reality, humans have lived on this earth for hundreds of thousands of years. We actually each and every one of us comes from generations of people who had a deeply connected understanding of the earth, though they may be really diverse. You know, folks from England probably had a very different conceptualization as to how they connected to their environment than Native American communities in New Mexico. Very different than maybe South African communities, maybe very different from communities in Bangladesh, for example. Those are very diverse worldviews, but those worldviews, something they probably all share is, because of obviously we all exist today, all those worldviews definitely shared an understanding that, okay, we're connected to the earth in some way. That, you know, when I use something that has an impact on somebody, and we kind of have to not necessarily only get back to that, but find a new way to look at things. So I think with scientists, once again, their work is absolutely important, but I also feel like the climate crisis isn't just a science issue. Honestly, it's probably a crisis, if you think about it, of spirituality. It's a crisis of our histories. It's a crisis of our economies. A lot of systems are broken for us to be in this circumstance where we are killing the earth. A lot of our systems are broken. And I think that something I'm really excited for in our emerging environmental movement is that it's not just about the scientists. It's also about, okay, what does the historian think? What does the person who studied divinity think? What does the sociologist think? What does the psychologist think? You know, and I think, and even that, what does the farmer think? What does the coal miner think? And how are all of us, in the way that we understand the environment, shifting in order to kind of create that new reality? So I think in terms of messaging, I think that's the key. I think bringing in folks who care about the climate crisis, but from different angles, because the messaging can't just be the polar bears, which are absolutely important. We need to save the polar bears. But for different communities, that's just not going to resonate. So how do we create different messagings, different kind of ways of understanding that gets people moving, that kind of stops the inertia of like, okay, I'm really scared. I don't know what to do. Maybe the science isn't working for everybody. How do we connect it to people's spiritualities? How do we connect it to people who are interested in literature, in their own histories, root it in very different ways, that it's not just a data issue, and make it real for a wider diversity of people and a wide diversity of thought?
Or caring about the neighbor who is seeing, depending on where they live, the impacts of climate change. Adrian, did you want to add to what Kwolanne suggested in terms of the messaging?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think messaging is super important, and that as you were talking, I was sort of reflecting on the direction that the environmental movement has been moving in previous decades, and thinking about in the 70s, a lot of consciousness about clean air, clean water, the birth of Earth Day, and then moving closer to the 90s, like more messaging about recycling as a new concept, and then moving into the 2000s, a lot of messaging about like plastics, veganism, vegetarianism, a lot of things that are traditionally associated with the environmental movement, and then starting in the 2010s, really trying to merge the environmental movement with the climate movement, which in my head, they do feel separate sometimes, which is unfortunate. And I really do want to see these two worlds come together. And like you were saying with like the polar bears, like even now, if I say like, oh, I'm an organizer on climate change, like some people might still think about like polar bears, straws, turtles as like what comes to mind when I say that. And really trying to bridge that gap between the environmental and the climate world, and really focusing our efforts on really, the biggest issue facing our planet right now, and honoring the different things that bring people to the environmental movement, while keeping our eyes on the prize, and really hammering down on greenhouse gas emissions and really trying to merge together to combat these larger goals. And yeah, thinking about the sort of divide in people's minds between like individual action and collective action, and that being like sort of a point of contention in the environmental movement, when ideally we need both, and hopefully a little more on the collective action side, given the importance of policy and our need to affect change around that matter. So yeah, definitely looking at environmental history and history in general is super important to understanding where we are today. And so it's really important that we focus our messaging in a way that resonates with people. Like for New Haven Climate Movement, you know, tying it locally is something that helps us. We have some street banners up in a couple of neighborhoods right now in New Haven that say climate solutions equals healthy neighborhoods. And we made those a few years ago. They're hand painted. And yeah, they feature like some images of homes, of windmills, of nice blue skies, and, you know, just things people would like to see, and things that make us healthy, you know, buses and everything, bikes, things like that, where we can imagine a better future, but also tailor that messaging to where we are at for different climate activists around the world, and really trying to find the sweet spot of something that resonates with people, makes them want to act, and also like combats like misconceptions about climate change or the environmental movement overall.
We'll be taking your questions in a couple of minutes, and I think they'll be passing a mic. But before we do, I wanted to ask each of you, what is one small step that each of us could take when we leave today?
Find your why. And I think, you know, for folks who already find your why, happy for you, keep going. But I think for folks who are a bit pessimistic, unsure as to, you know, what can I do? I think, as I said before, the climate movement, it isn't just a data question. It isn't just about, okay, how do I save the polar bears and become a vegan? That is not what we're up against. Once again, the climate crisis affects each and every one of us. Therefore, each and every one of us should have a unique meaningful why as to why this is important to us. So, and once again, that can come from a wide diversity of inspirations. Maybe it's art for you. Maybe something about sitting down, looking out your window and painting a beautiful scene really touches you. And you think to yourself, goodness, I really hope that when I pass this down to my grandchild, my great-grandchild, that they too can look at that scene, that it's not just going to be a past image, it's an image that they can continue to honor. Maybe it's music. Something about hearing the birds chirp really kind of inspires you. And you think to yourself, oh my God, I really want to assure that the mockingbird can be heard for generations to come. We are a part of the environment. The environment isn't this kind of distant thing that we are kind of entering. It is all around us. Let it be just food. Let it be like the way things smell, your clothing. There is infinite connections as to why the environment matters to you, because as I said, we're deeply tied to it. Finding that, returning to that, especially when the data gets cripplingly overwhelming, especially when it feels like there's no hope, kind of, you know, taking your mind away from that and just remembering, okay, why am I interested in this? Why am I doing this? It's because something about the earth, in whatever many ways it does do it for all of us, specifically resonates with me. And I deeply, deeply want this earth to, within all its beauty and its resources and its abundance and its generosity, to be passed down to folks to come. And yeah, and your why is going to be very different from my why. Personally, personal story, I love walking through Central Parks and like looking at the trees and like looking how big they are. And I'm like, wow, like you're so much older than me, much older than I will ever be. I hope that I can give back to you in the way that you give me, you know, through photosynthesis and through like the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Is it silly to some people? Absolutely. And it's okay that it's silly to you, because it's not for you. It's for me. It's something that kind of roots me and kind of reminds me why I'm doing this. And when things get frustrating doing this work, it reminds me why I need to keep going. Find that, ground in that, let that evolve, share it with others. But once again, it's okay if when you talk about it out loud, people are like, okay, what does this have to do with anything? That's okay. It's for you. It nourishes you. It brings you back. And after you find that why, and for folks who've already found that why, you know, get active. Let it be an individual action. I think you mentioned there tends to be a tension between, okay, recycling, is it really doing anything? Policies, if it's really doing anything. Start with the individual. That's okay. Because the individual action kind of once again nourishes us and allows us to move forward, but also don't stop at the individual. Unfortunately, recycling, composting is not everything. Let that kind of push you to sign a petition. Let that kind of push you to look into your local politicians and what they're doing. Let that kind of nourish you and push you to show up in your local city council meetings. But it also doesn't have to be all at once. As I said, Rome wasn't built in a day. It certainly didn't fall in a day. It's okay if it's something that you don't feel perfect at. You find you have to kind of back to the source, kind of pour more into your cup to remind yourself how to do it, and you have to come back to it and kind of build up that momentum and get folks engaged with you. But certainly find that why, find what fills your cup, and let that kind of push you to work on the individual, work on the local, and then push you even further. And that's okay.
Thank you. Adrian?
Yeah, I really love that message of finding your why and letting individual action nourish you. And yeah, thinking about my own life as like a avid public transportation user, and as someone who is like a climate organizer, I feel like living the why, and doing these things in my daily life with recycling, composting, using public transit, talking to people in real life about climate change, is something that nourishes the soul and then draws our attention to, okay, now let's try to make this happen on a wider scale. Let's look at it from a policy angle. So absolutely, I think trying those individual actions, and even that act alone, people might ask you questions, be like, oh, did you take the train here? And, that starts a conversation, and gets other people thinking about how they can make those sustainable changes in their own lives. And then, thinking about also your own role, whether personally or professionally. Like, I see some educators in the audience. And thinking about how climate change can be tied to your role professionally, whether that's teaching your students about different climate phenomenon, or just like sharing an article at the beginning of class, talking about some headlines, or if you're a pastor, like thinking about how you can incorporate environmental themes in your preaching. There's so many things people can do, even looking at hobbies. If you're a crafter, you could sell your art and then fundraise with a portion of the proceeds for some environmental or climate organization. You can cook for people who are staying late at a protest and they just need some food dropped off. There's so many ways you can plug into the movement without being on the ground as an organizer yourself. So start with that individual action, let it nourish yourself, let it inspire conversations with your friends and family. Then look at how you can plug in locally. Google is a wonderful tool. Just looking up different environmental organizations around you. Any locals in the audience, feel free to talk to us at the end about New Haven Climate Movement. We welcome people of all ages. And thinking about how you can show up in your own life and in your community with people already doing the work or starting something yourself.
Well, thank you, Adrian. I lost count of all the things that we can do, but it's important that that you shared those. Well, let's give a hand to Adrian Huq and Kwolanne Felix. Thank you so much.